Good morning and welcome back to the Reagan Red Zone. I'm your host, Webb Milward. Joining me today are two of our partners at Reagan, Tom Doran, the elder statesman, and Mark Crites, the young gun. Guys, good morning. Welcome to the Red Zone.
Good morning, Webb.
Good to be here. Thank you, Webb.
Yeah, excited to have you guys here. Let me set up today's topic and then we'll dive in. Guys, as we continue to move through 2025, insurance broker valuations, both internal and external, remain at all-time highs. Today, we're going to discuss these two very different valuation standards and approaches and how they ultimately relate to agency perpetuation. Now, more specifically, we're going to address how the industry has changed and how internal perpetuation strategies and the planning around them really needs to evolve due to these valuation dynamics. So the question we're going to try to solve for today for our listeners all around the world, is does your valuation approach line up with your perpetuation objectives? Are those two things in line and in harmony as you think about positioning your firm for the future? So with that, Tommy, you lead us off. A lot happening in the market. Firms are selling. Firms might have outdated perpetuation plans. Others are trying to do it, trying to stay committed to internal perpetuation. But what do you see happening right now in the market? And overall, is internal perpetuation still a thing in your mind?
100%. I know because we spend a lot of time with agents and brokers as clients. The vast majority of agents and brokers still intend to perpetuate internal. If you look at the Agency One numbers from the Big I for the last 10 or 15 years, the number of agents nationally remains pretty static at about 36,000 firms. And so even if 1,000 firms are selling a year, which is probably a pretty good estimate of the number of transactions over the last decade, that means 97% of firms are not selling in any given year, and they do remain very committed to internal perpetuation. The challenge is that the world has continued to change, and if your perpetuation model or plan was crafted in 1995 or even 2005, it's likely that it's out of date and out of touch with today's market realities. And so we're a strong advocate for agents remaining independent, and we'll talk a little bit more later about why that is, but would tell you that this is not a one and done exercise. It's something that you need to continue to pay attention to and update your plan accordingly.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Webb. I mean, we, as you think about that Agency One universe study that the Big I puts together every couple of years, the size and scale that is being amassed, which is talked about all the time, and is probably the most well-documented thing we talk about, the industry talks about, and so we want to try to think about it today in a different lens, to Tom's point, that internal perpetuation is still very much viable and achievable. It's just a different world. And if you think about, I was in a meeting just last week with a large broker that's on the top 100 listing, and they said, hey, we're not big enough. We're not big enough to do the things that the larger firms, the national brokers, the publicly traded brokers can do. And so even at 500 million, people are feeling that size insecurity. People at 100 million feel that size insecurity, and that's documented through some of the transaction activity that we've seen. And so the question is, how big is big enough? A lot of these big transactions that happened last year with a lot of the public brokers, Gallagher and AP and Marsh and McGriff, and then NFP and Aon, it's an amazing time in the industry. A lot of these firms are getting even bigger. And so what happens is that the independent firm has to kind of reimagine themselves a little bit. To Tom's point, the 05 plan, the 95 plan, even the 15 plan, it's a different market today.
Yeah. So, I mean, given the marketplace and thinking about today's record valuations, how do you see that impacting a firm's perpetuation plan? And maybe Mark will go to you here.
Yeah. So, we always want to make sure that our clients are focused on establishing the goals first. What do we want to achieve? If long-term internal perpetuation is the goal, let's set those goals in place and then let the valuation almost fall into place. And so we're going to talk about internal valuations that we do on an annual basis with clients, and then external valuations. And so I'll start with the internal piece. And still, as Tom mentioned, that's the majority of our industry. While lots of consolidation activity, the majority of firms in the industry are still trying to perpetuate internally, whether that's within the family, whether that's through ESOPs, whether that's through a bunch of different vehicles. I think maybe try to break down the internal valuation concept here for a second, because it is wildly different than the valuations that a lot of folks hear on the street and cite to us. And many, probably the most often cited and most commonly maybe misstated number in the industry is, hey, what's your value? What do you trade for? And a lot of that time is focused on the external thing. But so let's think about the internal valuations. And so we at Reagan do a lot of internal appraisals every year. And the purpose of those appraisals is to serve the internal perpetuation goals of our clients, of independent agents and brokers. And those are for, again, internal equity transfers when one shareholder is passing shares to the next, or a new shareholder is coming in, a shareholder is going out. How to facilitate those transactions, at what value do you do that? And so that's the goal. And so how do you calculate it? Well, you can hire someone like Reagan. You can hire a valuation consultant in the industry that knows the industry and can help you identify future cash flows of the business. And the independent valuation is really dependent upon how much cash that your agency can generate on an annual basis, because that ultimately is what's going to fund retirement buyouts, folks that are buying in. How do they take big sums of money out? And as you think about this demand in the marketplace that has really accelerated since the Great Recession, with private equity coming in, with this acquisition kind of frenzy that we've had, you've seen demand push valuations up. The supply of larger firms, regional firms, even high quality growing firms is different than it was even 10 years ago. And while a lot of those firms are still out there, it's becoming a different story. And so that demand has pushed valuations up for those really high quality firms. And so our client database right now is averaging about a 9 times profit as an internal multiple of cash flow. So we think about EBITDA, which is pre-tax cash flow, 9 times that. If you rewind 10 years ago, that number was 5, 6, 7 times, Tom. And so, that run up has been incredible. It's not just the external markets that I think Tom is going to hit, but it's the internal markets that you have to factor in that external pressure and external market dynamics that ultimately impact the internal valuation. But that 9 times average multiple that we're seeing for internal firms that are growing, well established, have leadership teams, that's a harder value to buy in at for somebody in their 20s and 30s. That's just that number has changed with interest rates where they are. That creates a really, really tough dynamic. A lot of firms are still finding ways to perpetuate internally, even with higher valuations, because they can adjust long-term, have long-term seller notes outstanding. They can access debt markets that are more friendly, more industry lenders that are active in the space. And so anyways, you have this demand pushing value up. You have results from brokers. We talk about our quarterly survey for GPS that is also bolstering the valuation as well. We've averaged as an industry about 10% organic growth the last few years. That's incredible, but it's also pushed pressure, because valuations have increased as a result. So again, just trying to lay the groundwork this is still very viable. We're talking about maybe options a little bit later about if you're trying to figure out the gap between internal, external, and Tom's going to talk about that in a second. What do you do? But I mean, Tom, from our perspective, 5, 7 times 10 years ago, that felt pretty good then. 9 times today, who wouldn't sell for that? Everybody's selling for that, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think back 10 to 15 years, a lot has changed, and valuations for sure. Mark's mom calls me about once a week to check in on him and make sure that his career is on track. That's a function of his generation. We get it. We're pretty sensitive to it. And 15 years ago, Mark, your mom was, driving you and Mary Lou McGillicuddy to, for your Saturday afternoon date to Chuck E. Cheese. And at that time, agents...
Ain't on Chuck E. Cheese, Tom. Come on now.
That was before you went skating. So a lot's changed in the last 10 or 15 years. But yeah, heck yeah. If you tell an agency that they can sell for 9 times today, that's a 50% premium versus what it would have commanded even a decade ago. So it's been a great run. And so internal perpetuation valuations have increased along with the rest of the industry. And that's very cool. The second standard of value that Webb alluded to a few minutes ago is an external valuation. And this would be the price at which an agent or broker would sell to a third-party buyer, whether it's private equity or a publicly traded broker or another local competitor broker. But those valuations are very different. And they're different really for a handful of reasons, but mostly so because it has a completely different assumption set. Your agency, Mark was alluding to an internal valuation. An internal valuation, when we talk about that, we're really talking about a going concern valuation based on how you're running your business today, based on the cash flow that it's generating for you. What is the valuation of the company? Now, in a third-party valuation, typically profit margins go up dramatically as a third-party buyer will eliminate discretionary and non-recurring activity. And so you're left with a very, very different pro forma level of profitability. The average client that Reagan would work with might be generating a 22% or so profit margin. Mark, does that sound about right?
That's exactly right.
Internal basis. And it's very common when you go to market and strip all of that activity out, non-recurring discretionary activity, that you'd be selling at a margin of more in the neighborhood of 30 to 35%. So it's a very different assumption set. And, current norms for valuation, Mark referred to a 9x valuation internally. It varies dependent on size. Larger brokers sell for much larger premiums than smaller brokers, and smaller brokers might trade today at, call it 10x EBITDA, or and at the very high end, 14 or plus times EBITDA. That 10x EBITDA number that I referred to there maybe doesn't sound that much higher than the 9x that Mark referred to a minute ago. But remember, not only is the multiple a bit higher, the profit on which that multiple is applied is significantly higher. And as a result, third-party valuations outpace internal valuations anywhere from 50 to 100% or more, depending on the specifics. And so there's a really wide gap between internal and external valuations. And so,
yeah. I'll just jump in there, Tom. I meant to clarify this earlier. The 9 times may be a median for our data set, but that includes some larger firms that are still independently perpetuating. We have clients that may be still valued at 7 or 8 times, and that's which is great. That'll satisfy. If you have willing buyers and willing sellers, then you can get to a place where it makes sense for everybody. And it'll, to your point, be size dependent, growth dependent, margin dependent. But then you start to think about, when you think about 7 or 8 versus 10, 11, as you mentioned, and then as you go up the size category range, it does build that gap quite a bit. Applying it.
And I'll make one final point. You might be a broker out there thinking, well, Jiminy Crickets, I don't want to perpetuate at 9x if 14x is market. Let's go with that approach. The challenge with that is that internal buyers rely on actual cash flows, not theoretical cash flows, when they're servicing debt. So if you were to push your value artificially higher based on market multiples, what you would find very quickly is that your perpetuation plan, which largely relies on cash flows to satisfy debt, is most likely going to be rendered dead on arrival. It just won't work.
So right there with that comment, Tom, you're addressing why not just use external valuation estimates for internal transactions? You're sort of alluding to that with your cash flow comment. And just by the way, if Mary Lou McGillicuddy is listening, we hope she's doing really well. I'm sure she's found the brokerage space. But anyway, Tom, go on. That's really the reason those estimates don't really apply in this scenario.
That's right, Webb. Yeah, you don't miss much. For a kid from Kentucky, more skilled at talking about crop yields, you have unusual insight into this industry, and that's dead on.
And pork bellies.
Bourbon barrels. Yeah,
Mark, what are your other thoughts on this before we move on?
I was just thinking about the time, the time that has, Tom mentioned 95 to 05 and then now to 25, thinking about what's changed. And, one of the things that's changed a lot, and I'll come back to valuations, is technology. And, Tom used to be our IT director, which may be terrifying for some of you thinking about Tom Doran here being our IT director, but now he's starting to blame technology for issues that come up in our office. Just the other day, we order lunch in every day since COVID, and it's been a great thing for our team. We get to sit around the couches every day, and it's just, it's a great time for camaraderie, get to know each other. But, when Tom orders on DoorDash, sometimes he thinks he's getting a salad, he gets a sandwich. But to him, technology ordered it for him. And so he took the salad from one of our associates, and poor Topher, had to eat a big meaty sandwich that day that Tom really ordered. And some people, Tom blames technology. Maybe I would just say user error, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
But thank goodness for Ben. Thank goodness for Ben as our new IT director. So thinking, again, pivoting back to the valuations, we have seen clients try to morph their perpetuation to help bridge this gap. As top externals and internals, if you focus completely on cash flows and you use debt to service those, that you use cash flows to service the debt that you take out to buy into the agency, you do that at 12 or 13 times, it's not going to be pretty, and it's going to hurt. And so what we have seen clients do, I'll give you an example, is adopt things like a stock grant model. And basically, instead of paying for stock, grants are given as compensation expense. You still have to pay taxes on it. And so, the question we get a lot is, whoa, I'm not going to give somebody something. Well, if you base it on performance, you base it on book growth, hitting various thresholds, $500,000 in revenue, $1 million, $2 million, et cetera, and you incent producers in particular to hit these thresholds that deliver value for the shareholders, you grant them equity along the way. You make sure they retain their business. You can have clawbacks if you want, but that's a non-cash expense for the agency outside of the taxes that the individual is receiving. That's a great way to, if you want to remain independent, but you're going to have sellers that are going to be really struggling with that gap between internal and external. Gosh, what a great way to thread that needle. And a lot of independent firms have done that to make sure that they can, one, perpetuate. Two, if they want to be competitive in M&A, they wanted to lift their valuation up a little bit. They adjust their perpetuation model to work with the valuation structure, and then they can do a lot of other things as well. And it's one, another bullet is it's non-cash. And so you're saving cash to invest back in the business, to invest in acquisitions and tools and resources, et cetera. And so just one way, there are lots of ways to do it. That's just an example. We've seen folks that are trying to bridge that gap have done that successfully.
Yeah. So to build on that, let's keep going in there. What are the keys then to internal valuation success, and how can firms kind of update their game plan given what we've established here are today's market dynamics? That was a good example there from Mark. Tom, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, as I was thinking about this, things came. So I would say there are 4 keys to success in internal perpetuation. And the first is to ensure that your valuation standard is based on actual cash flow rather than some type of third-party multiple, or even Mark and I do a lot of perpetuation planning. We still run into a lot of agents and brokers who have their valuation dialed in at a multiple of revenue or a multiple of profit, most commonly a multiple of revenue. And that was something I saw at Reagan when I came here in 1993. That is a really, really dangerous way to value your business because multiples have changed and continue to change over time. So first and foremost, evaluation based on actual cash flows in light of the way you're running your business right now. Because if Mark owns an agency and he's growing by 15% a year, spitting off a 30% profit margin, Webb, same size agency, but hasn't grown since Happy Days was in first run and nominally profitable. If we say both of those agencies are worth 1.5 times, Webb is being dramatically overpaid for his equity, whereas Mark is leaving a lot of money on the table. So key number 1 would be an appropriate valuation based on cash flow. Key number 2, and this has been a big focus point for the industry over the last few years, even if you're using a cash flow-based appraisal by somebody like Reagan. 15 years ago, it's fairly common that if Mark is buying equity, we're going to give him 6 or 7 years to pay that money back. And based on valuations at that time, that was not an unreasonable approach. Now, valuations have gone way up over the same time period. if we're still asking Mark to pay that out over 6 or 7 years, he's really going to struggle to do it. And so one of the things that we've seen our clients do is really adjust the terms of the buy. We don't artificially deflate the value, but instead of 6 or 7 years to pay now, maybe it's 10 or 12 years to pay. And maybe we've eliminated the need for a down payment. Maybe we've gone to more of a market level interest rate. So the key to really making internal equity affordable is not really so much artificially discounting the value. It's about adjusting the terms for purchase to ensure that a buyer can afford to pay for it. Number 3 would be just have a broad ownership pool. Having 30 or 40 owners, any one leaves it in a given year, it doesn't create that much drama. If you've only got 3 owners and a 40 or a 50% shareholders checking out in a year, it can be super, super challenging. And so a broad ownership pool, we've seen it 1,000 times over the years. It's much better to have a smaller piece of a much larger pie than it is to kind of have a control focus on a vast majority of a much smaller pie.
And that's really to take the pressure off of one individual or single perpetuation event that could really change the whole landscape for that agency or force them to do something maybe they don't want to do.
That's right. That's right. And, one question would be, how can you assume that the pie will be bigger if we bring in more younger owners? And what we see in the industry is talent flows towards equity opportunities. And so you're not going to be able to attract that high potential producer with a book of business to come join you if it's just meet the new boss, same as the old boss. If you allow those younger producers who join you to grow into equity opportunities, it's very sticky. They're much less likely to leave you. And so you're left with a significant advantage in the recruiting pool, and recruiting is directly correlated to value improvement. The more producers of value that you can attract to the agency by allowing for equity sharing, the larger the pie is going to be. Even though you have a smaller piece of it, that smaller piece is typically going to be significantly more valuable than it would have been had you, clutched those cookies all to yourself.
Yeah. So here we come back around to a topic we touch on a lot in the red zone here, which is just recruiting, right? And the relentless pursuit of talent, whether that's developing your own talent, young, inexperienced talent, or finding experienced talent that might be happier, in your shop. And obviously the equity opportunity is going to be a key to that conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, a couple folks may be out there listening and say, hey, we can't do anything about our capital structure. We have different ownership. It's family owned, it's bank owned, it's ESOP, whatever it may be. And we can't get equity into the hands maybe as efficiently or effectively as others. And so there are other vehicles that we've seen people adopt where, think about stock appreciation rights or options or various synthetic equity vehicles that allow key performers to be rewarded. And so, as you mentioned, Tom, talent follows equity, talent follows wealth creation opportunities. And the more you can align contributors with value, the better.
Yeah. And Webb, I think you're dead on. Producer recruiting is job one for a CEO. One of my partners, Kevin Stipe, I'll never forget 10 or 15 years ago, kind of an offhand remark that the number one job of an insurance broker CEO is producer recruiting. And Kevin really rarely says anything that's of any value. So whenever it does, it really catches my attention. And I think there's a tremendous amount of truth to that the highest and best calling of an effective CEO is going to be attracting and developing production talent. And that certainly goes a long way towards ensuring valuations are maximized, whether you choose to sell externally or internally. Your young producer team that's killing big numbers is going to be the thing that's really going to put you over the top in terms of value. And then you've got all kinds of cool options.
That's great. That's well said. Any other kind of key takeaways or final comments here as we wrap?
Yeah, I would just say, excuse me, we did develop a metric a few years back called NUP, Net Unvalidated Producer Payroll. If you're a listener and you're hearing this and believing, that maybe producer recruiting is a key to perpetuation success, we developed a metric called NUP, net unvalidated producer payroll. A healthy level is roughly 2% of an agency's revenue. So it's not a crazy high number. If you're a $10 million broker, that means you should be really investing about $200,000 a year in payroll associated with unvalidated producers. That's a pretty cool metric to think about if you're scratching your head and wondering, do we have enough young producers or not? Are we investing enough in our future? That's a pretty cool metric to consider.
Mark?
I mean, nothing really else. I think it's this reinvestment mentality in people and resources and technology, et cetera, to be able to continue to compete effectively. And the more focus you have dedicated to recruiting after you align your perpetuation and valuation strategy, then that stuff can follow. But setting up the structure, and really it's, part of that is strategic planning, getting your board together, getting your shareholder group together, and making sure you have, hey, what's our 5-year, 10-year, 15-year goal? And if we want to get to 50 million, if we want to get to 100 million, how do we accomplish that with a new perpetuation plan that's going to attract the right people?
Sure. Yeah. And I think my thought would be, internal perpetuation is still the preferred path, right? And we all know what a great industry this is. The economics continue to prove themselves out year over year. And I think our comment to our listeners is just take a look at your perpetuation plan, make sure it is well suited for today's market realities so that you can continue to fuel growth and ensure perpetuation. It's certainly a space that we enjoy playing in. So yes, thank you for conversation.
Before we sign off, can I?
Sure.
Mark raised the question of size insecurity a few minutes ago. If you're struggling at 500 million in revenue to feel like, you're big enough, how should a 5, 10, 15, $20 million broker think about that same size insecurity? And maybe what are a few strategies that a broker might employ to allow them to sleep at night?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me, Tom. It's that reinvestment mentality that I mentioned. At least that's what comes to mind first. And because that the lifestyle agency that we've talked a lot about over, our course of our 30 years being in business, those agencies are going to have a tougher time because competition is continuing to heat up. Investors are really pushing people to perform. Organic growth is at all-time highs. Our industry performance has been so good. Soft market may change that a little bit. We'll see. But having that mentality of let's not sit around. We need to continue to invest 15 to 20%. We need to grow our production force 15 to 20% a year in order to ultimately get to that 10, 15% organic growth that we need, especially in a market that's changing. So recruiting has got to be the bottom line, as we talked about. But I think in order to get there, you have to step back for a second, understand what are our goals? What do we want to accomplish? How is our perpetuation plan set up? And set up in a way that it incentivizes and attracts the people that we want to attract. And does it align equity and contribution with value?
So listen, we have a tradition in the red zone, and you guys are not above it, which is our 2-minute drill where we like to get a little personal. And, the easy layup here would have been to talk about March Madness. We're in the eve of March Madness here. And for most of our young analysts out there, their desktops right now probably are filled with more brackets than they are valuation spreadsheets, but we'll hopefully survive as a firm over the next 3.5 weeks. But want to get a little more personal with the two of you. I find it interesting. You guys graduated high school exactly 30 years apart. Tom, 1978, Mark, 2008. So here's the question, Tom. I'll go to you first. In 1978, what won Best Picture at the Oscars? And if you don't want to answer that question, what was the number one band 1978 in terms of hits on the charts?
Best Picture was clearly Caddyshack, and so that's an easy one. And I would say, based on my listening at that time, REO Speedwagon really kind of ruled the day. So I'm going to go with REO Speedwagon and Caddyshack. Porky's would be a second.
Well, we're going to keep it clean here in the red zone today. Annie Hall won Best Picture in 1978, which is not that interesting. What's interesting is It beat out Star Wars and Rocky for Best Picture. I think the Academy should probably go back and take another look at 1978. So now that I've given Mark time to AI his answers, let's ask him a question. Mark, 2008, Best Picture at the Oscars and #1 song at the top of the Billboard charts.
Chat GPT is loading, so give me just like.
And Mark,
Yeah.
it wasn't Clifford the Big Red Dog. So you can take that.
That was playing at Chuck E. Cheese when he was on that date.
I know that was a favorite of yours.
I was thinking of a Denzel Washington movie that came out around then. It was like I'll put a Denzel movie because I can't think of the name right now, Webb. Maybe like an American Gangster.
Close. No Country for Old Men won Best Picture that year. Great movie.
That's an upbeat movie.
And I'll skip ahead. The #1 song that year, one of Tom's favorites on his playlist on the drive to work, was Single Ladies by Beyonce.
Who's Beyonce?
And we have now concluded. Guys, thank you so much for joining the Red Zone today. To our listeners, we appreciate you joining us. If it's your first time, thanks for being here. If you've been consistently listening, we really appreciate it. We're going to continue to put out a Red Zone once a month and look forward to continued conversations. Guys, have a great day.
Thanks, Webb. Thank you, Mark.